We saw when working with layers that we want to make a selection to designate a specific area of that layer or of our image that we're going to be working on. If we're not making a selection, not designating that specific area, then we're working on the entire image. For example, if I go to the adjustment layers and choose hue saturation, it's going to put an adjustment layer over the layer I was selected on, and it's doing full coverage of that entire image, of everything beneath that, because I didn't choose any specific area on that layer, on the image, to adjust. So it's doing that, it's performing that adjustment on all areas of that layer. However, if I choose, I can actually designate a specific area. I'll delete this adjustment layer. And there's several ways that we can make selections. We saw when we were working on the layers and we had a specific size to this layer. The image was in the center of the layer and it was a certain size, so there was a discernible object there. If we command click on the thumbnail of that layer, that creates a selection of whatever is on that layer. If I put on here, for example, I'll do command D to deselect. If I paste a logo on here, that pastes in as its own layer, and then even for that I can command click and it will select exactly what's on that layer. So that's one way to make a quick selection of whatever is on a layer. Command D to deselect. However, we can certainly, actually I'm going to just undo a bit to get back to where I was there. We can certainly be far more deliberate with our selections. So not only can we click on the thumbnail, but we can go over to the selection marquees here. And these are shape-based selections. So I can click on that, and if I hold down, I get the rectangle, the ellipse, or single pixel, single row. Those we don't use too often, but there are definitely uses for them. And even these, even the shape selections, the rectangle and the ellipse, they're not ones that we use too much, but they do have their common uses. So that's essentially just clicking and dragging. And if you click and drag, and while holding that with my mouse down, I add the space bar in, I can move that selection, let go of the space bar, click and drag, and essentially get a little more specific as I need to. So that selects that area. Now with that, I've selected that area. I'm clicked on that layer. I can delete. I'll undo that. I can edit. So I'll go to the edit and transform and scale. So I'm going to be scaling that portion of it. If I press return, then that's done. Deselect. So I've scaled just that piece of it. I can do anything that I really want to as far as what Photoshop will let me do to that specific area of the image, because that's what I've selected. Same thing with the circle. I can use the ellipse, and if I hold shift, it will constrain to a perfect circle. And if I let go of shift, it will do its own thing. I can hold shift, add the space bar. So I have shift, space bar, and my mouse selected right now. And I can move that around, and again I can delete. I can add an adjustment layer to that portion. I can do whatever I want based on that selection. Now if I have a specified adjustment layer where I've taken a very fine area like that and made an adjustment layer of it, I can even do the command click on the adjustment layer to get that selection back. So not only do the thumbnails let me do a command click, but so do the adjustment layers as well. I'll do command D to get rid of that and get rid of this adjustment layer. And I almost tried to delete that group there. I did try to delete that group and then realized it was the group I'm working on. So good thing I didn't get rid of that. And what we can do with selections, of course, as we get more specific, we can modify them. We can we can apply effects, and that's where we do want to be specific. We want to apply things to maybe even very small areas. So there's ways to make those very specific, very careful selections. And one thing I can do, and this is something that we use sometimes, but if we use the magic wand here, and I select on a portion of my image, so making sure, again, you can see I was on the group there and it wouldn't let me do anything. I have to be on that image. I can click right in there, for example, that dark area, and it did make a selection there. Made a very small selection. Command 0. I'll go to select and I'll go similar. Now what it's going to do is get all of the pixels, it's selecting all of the pixels that were similarly covered. On something like this, that's not so useful because this is quite a complex image and there's probably no reason that I would do that. But I just want to exhibit that it will search the entire image for similar pixels. If I press delete, we'll see how much it actually got. And I can hide the selection, Command H. It'll still be selected, but it's just hiding. So it did get a fair bit there. Command H will bring that back, and I'll undo, and Command D to deselect. So we can select similar, and there's of course the select menu. So if you have a selection, I'll make another circle here, you can go to the select menu and you can see the options. You can create that selection on all layers. You can invert the selection. This is very handy if you've selected something specifically, but then you want everything around it to be worked on. You can invert the selection and you can see that it's selected everything around it. So in this case, I'll just add a new layer and I'm going to fill that layer with black so we can see it. So black is in my foreground here, so I'm going to do Option, Delete, and that fills it. So that shows that it got the inverse of that. Select None, and I'll just delete this as well. So we can, once we have a selection, we have a lot of options that we can do with it, and even the modify. So make one again here. We can go to Select and modify the selection. We can add a border, we can smooth it if it's quite complex, and so on. You can play around with these. One thing that I do use quite often is transform selection. So that will let me, like we did with the layer, in the layers tutorial, we can see where we can actually change that selection. We can modify it. We can use the shift key to skew it and so on. So it almost becomes like an object, the way we can modify the selection. And then click the check mark or press return and it will stay that way. The other ways, of course, is with what many that are new to Photoshop tend to use is the lasso tool. And although it's not very specific, and especially when you want to be very specific, it's not a good tool to use. However, it is one of the go-tos when you're just trying to get a quick selection, as you can see in the video. So I can select a certain area here, and I can go right outside the canvas there, and then it gets that. And so the lasso really does become a good quick select tool that way. Where some will try, if they don't know how to really do very careful selecting, they'll try to travel along something like this, and that's not advisable because you're definitely not being as accurate as you probably want to be. There is one aspect to the lasso that can be helpful. If you hold down and you go to the polygonal, where that will do selections, you click and kind of click around like that, and it'll do the straight lines. And the magnetic, this is very dependent on high contrast situations where we can click and drag, and it has to be high contrast and really quite simple. This is a complex graphic that has a lot of variances, so you can see that it's finding it difficult to be truly accurate. But when you use this, you want to actually do a complete selection. And then when you double click, it'll make its connection. So we do have some quick options. However, they're usually still not as accurate as we need. When we really need to be specific, very specific to what we're selecting. For example, if I wanted to select these windows, I would use the pen tool, and that's right here. And what the pen tool does is create a path. I'll open up my paths palette for a moment. Now the pen tool is one that takes definitely some getting to know. Now it looks like this image actually came with a work path, which is great. Many images do, and this one did. It came actually provided with a work path. So if I command click even on that path thumbnail, we'll see actually it's not a very good work path. So this may be one that I created earlier. So I'm going to get rid of that. But some images do come with work paths, especially if they're an image on white space like this. So I think that's something that I did earlier and just didn't know I made a work path. So using the pen tool, what the pen tool does is create a path. And then we use that path as a tool to make a selection. The pen tool is one of the most valuable tools to learn in the Adobe suite based on what we can do with it. And it's used in Illustrator, it's used in Photoshop and InDesign and several other programs as well. But once you've learned it in one of the programs, you know how to use the tool. It just does different things in different programs. In Photoshop, we can use it as a vector tool because a path is a vector element, just like in Illustrator. It works on anchor points, and depending on how we use it in Photoshop, it's fully vector. However, it really shines in Photoshop when we use it to create selections. So I'll just select a couple of windows here. The thing is, it's very challenging to learn. It really is something that takes time and patience to learn. I'm going to do another tutorial on the pen tool down the road, but I do want to explain that with it, you can get very careful selections. So I'm just going to make a path around this window. And pretty quickly, I can get an accurate selection of that. Now that's a path, and you can see it very small, but it's put that working path in there. Now I can command click on that thumbnail there, or with the pen tool I can right click on the path here and make a selection. I'm going to actually go up to another window while I'm selected on this path, and I'm going to make another selection here. So make another path. I'm not being overly accurate, but that's okay. One of the good things with this is that once I've made a path, I can go down here in my tools to the direct select tool, and there's the selection tool, but I'm going to use the direct select. We've seen this in Illustrator and InDesign, and I can zoom in and I can actually correct that path. I can click on one line of it and adjust it. I can click on these handles, and I can click on the anchor points, and I can adjust very accurately that path. And the reason I would adjust it is because I'm going to turn this path into a selection. So if I was trying to get a very accurate, very precise selection of something, which we often are in Photoshop, then I would go through that adjustment and then make a selection of it. And it would give me this little window saying basically how accurate do you want that selection. And by default, I always leave this. It's very rare that I need to change these. So usually we're just leaving them set at what they are. I'll say okay. And then that makes that selection. This one hasn't been selected. So if I wanted both, that's where I would go to the thumbnail, and then I can command click and it's create a selection of both. I'll go over to my layers, make an adjustment layer, and then I can see when I make some adjustments that it's chosen those. So you can see if I was going to do maybe color the windows on all of this, I would do very accurate selections using the pen tool so that I get a very clean edit to the image. So the pen tool really is the ultimate selection tool. It takes time, practice, precision, but in Photoshop we typically are trying to be quite precise. So we do have a lot of options for selecting. It's just something to be aware of when it comes to precision. We're not going to get a lot of precision from the lasso tools. The marquees are quite general in shape and space. And then even with the magic wand, that needs high contrast environments. And the quick selection tools, you can try them out, but they're quite similar. They just need really high contrast environments. You can see what it's doing. I just kind of circle through, and it's just Photoshop making some guesses. That's all. So if it's quite a complex image, it's just not going to do what we need it to do. So my encouragement when it comes to selections in Photoshop is always to learn that pen tool. And we will be doing tutorials in the future, and there's some on my YouTube about the pen tool, but it's one that there are a lot of great tutorials out there and some excellent how-tos, even in Adobe, and it really is the one to be learning. And not only for selecting, but for its diversity through all of the Adobe programs.